Maria Carvalho woke up on a Tuesday morning in Buenos Aires and checked her bank account. Zero. Not because she had spent anything. Not because of fraud. The Argentine government had frozen every private account in the country overnight. Savings she had built over 20 years. Gone. Inaccessible. Behind a wall of policy she had never voted for, negotiated by people she had never met, to repay obligations she had never agreed to. She went to the bank anyway. She stood in line for 4 hours. The teller looked at her and said, "There is nothing I can do." That morning, Argentina owed $144 billion to creditors around the globe. Maria owed nothing to anyone, but she paid. This is a story about who countries actually owe, and what happens to ordinary people when the answer to that question stops making sense. Every functioning government on Earth carries debt. This is not a crisis. This is the architecture of modern statehood. When a government spends more than it collects through taxation, and almost every government does almost every year, it needs to bridge the gap. The mechanism it uses is called a sovereign bond, a promise issued on official paper that says, lend us money today, and in 10, 20, or 30 years, we will return it, with interest. Who buys these promises? That question has 4 answers, and each one reveals a different layer of how power actually moves through the global economy. The first answer surprises most people. Your own bank probably holds some of your government's debt. Your pension fund almost certainly does. Insurance companies, domestic investment vehicles, national savings institutions. When ordinary citizens deposit money into financial systems, those systems quietly recycle a portion of it back into government bonds. The government borrows from the population it governs. The population earns modest interest. The arrangement appears circular and harmless, until the government cannot pay. At that point, the first people to absorb the loss are not foreign hedge funds or distant creditors. They are retirees watching their pensions evaporate. They are families whose savings are frozen or inflated away. The government that borrowed from its own citizens can also, with a printing press, silently reduce what it owes by making the currency worth less. You lent it $100 of purchasing power. It returns $100 of currency, worth 60. Legal, quiet, devastating. The second layer is foreign governments. When one nation lends to another, the transaction is never purely financial. It carries diplomatic weight that accumulates over years, sometimes decades. Countries that hold each other's debt negotiate differently than countries that do not. The creditor nation carries a form of silent leverage into every conversation about trade, military access, political alignment. Nothing is stated directly. Nothing needs to be. The math speaks for itself across the negotiating table. The third layer is the institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the regional development banks that operate across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These are the lenders who arrive when everyone else has left. The ones who pick up the phone at 3 in the morning when a currency is collapsing and a finance minister is out of options. Their arrival is never free. The fourth layer is newer, more contested, and more geopolitically charged than anything that came before it. But to understand why it matters, we first need to go to Southeast Asia in the autumn of 1997. It began with the Thai baht. On July 2, 1997, the Thai government abandoned its fixed exchange rate under pressure from currency speculators. The baht lost a third of its value almost overnight. What followed moved faster than any financial crisis the modern world had seen. Capital, billions of dollars of foreign investment, flooded out of Southeast Asia in days. Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, the Philippines. Economies that had been celebrated for decades as miracles of development began to buckle under the speed of the reversal. By the time the dust settled, Indonesia's economy had contracted by more than 13% in a single calendar year. Unemployment surged, food prices spiked. In the streets of Jakarta, people who had spent years building modest, stable lives found that stability had vanished, not because they had done anything wrong, but because of decisions made in trading rooms in New York and London. The International Monetary Fund arrived with tens of billions of dollars in emergency financing. It also arrived with conditions. Cut government expenditure, raise interest rates, dismantle subsidies on fuel and food, open domestic industries to foreign acquisition, reduce the role of the state in the economy, and allow market forces to determine outcomes. The government signed. They had no other path. But what the IMF prescribed, and this is now documented extensively, including in the fund's own retrospective analyses, made several crises significantly worse before they improved. Slashing public expenditure inside a collapsing economy removes the last cushion between struggling families and destitution. Raising interest rates when businesses are already failing accelerates their collapse. Opening markets to external capital during a fire sale environment invites the purchase of national assets at fractions of their actual worth. Indonesia signed the agreement in January 1998. IMF Managing Director Michel Kamdesis stood beside Indonesian President Suharto as he put pen to paper, arms folded, looking downward. Photographers captured the moment. Across Indonesia, the image read as humiliation. A sovereign nation, cap in hand, accepting terms it had not written from an institution it did not control. Suharto had governed Indonesia for 32 years. He was gone by May. The loans were eventually repaid. The interest was collected on schedule. The institution that had administered the conditions acknowledged years later that some of its prescriptions had been miscalibrated. The acknowledgement came after the damage had already been absorbed by the people least equipped to absorb it. In 2013, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, an infrastructure financing program eventually extended to more than 140 countries. Highways through landlocked Central Asia, deep water ports in East Africa, power generation facilities across South and Southeast Asia. The financing came from Chinese state banks at rates that appeared competitive and without the political conditionality that made IMF engagement domestically toxic in borrowing nations. No requirements to restructure pension systems. No demands regarding market liberalization. No public lectures about governance reform delivered by officials from wealthy nations that had never faced comparable pressures. Just capital, just concrete and steel. But investigative journalists and development economists who tracked these arrangements over years began identifying a pattern in certain cases. When recipient governments found themselves unable to service the loans, when projected revenues from new infrastructure fell below the figures used to justify borrowing, the response differed from what a standard commercial lender might offer. Sri Lanka provides the most examined example. The government borrowed from Chinese state institutions to finance construction of Hambantota Port, a project backed by projections of commercial traffic that never materialized at anticipated levels. Debt payments mounted. By 2017, following extended negotiations between Colombo and Beijing, Sri Lanka transferred operational control of the port to a Chinese state-owned enterprise on a 99-year lease. Critics called the outcome a debt trap, a deliberate strategy of extending loans with unachievable repayment terms, then extracting strategic assets when default became inevitable. China rejected the characterization. Sri Lanka's government at the time maintained the arrangement was voluntary and commercially rational. Several independent economists argued that Sri Lanka's fiscal difficulties were systemic and predated Chinese lending, that attributing the port deal solely to predatory strategy oversimplified a complicated sovereign decision made under genuine financial pressure. The debate remains unsettled among scholars who study it professionally. What is not debated is the underlying reality the situation illustrated. When a nation cannot repay infrastructure obligations in currency, the negotiation shifts toward other forms of settlement. Strategic geography. Political alignment. Abstentions in international forums, a vote in the United Nations General Assembly. The currency of sovereign debt has never been only money. By 2023, according to World Bank data, low and middle-income nations were directing a record proportion of government revenue toward debt service. Not toward reducing principal, not toward building hospitals or funding classrooms, but simply toward paying interest on what they already carried. In some of the world's most impoverished countries, more capital exits each year in debt payments than enters through international development assistance. The aid flows in, a larger amount flows back out. Zambia, Ghana, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Argentina. Again, decades after Maria stood in that bank line. The list of nations that have defaulted or sought emergency restructuring in recent years is long and growing. After Argentina's catastrophic 2001 collapse, at that point the largest sovereign default in recorded history, the government negotiated restructured terms with most of its creditors. Most accepted reduced repayment. Most recognized that something was better than nothing, and that Argentina's population had already absorbed enough. A group of hedge funds did not accept. These funds had purchased Argentine bonds at deeply discounted prices after the initial collapse. They then sued in American courts for full repayment at face value. A United States federal judge ruled in their favor, ordering that Argentina could not pay its cooperative creditors until it satisfied the holdout funds entirely. For years, Argentina was effectively barred from international credit markets, not because it refused all obligations, because a handful of investment firms that had acquired distressed paper for a fraction of its stated worth demanded every cent of that stated worth, enforced through foreign courts, in a foreign jurisdiction, under foreign law. The funds collected. Financial press coverage referred to them as vulture funds, a phrase that spread through headlines globally. The funds argued they were enforcing legitimate contractual rights. Their critics argued that American courts had been converted into instruments for extracting resources from a struggling nation on behalf of investors whose entire position was built on that nation's crisis. Both descriptions contain truth. That is precisely what makes it worth understanding. Here is what almost never appears in the coverage of any individual debt crisis. The system itself was not assembled through accident or gradual historical drift. It was constructed deliberately at a specific location by specific people in a specific week in July 1944. Bretton Woods died a resort in the mountains of New Hampshire. 44 nations gathered as the Second World War approached its end. The stated purpose was to design a stable global financial architecture that would prevent the economic chaos of the interwar years from recurring. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. The International Monetary Fund was created. The World Bank was established. The legal frameworks governing international lending were drafted. And every one of these decisions was made by nations that would become, within a generation, the primary creditors of the developing world. The minutes from Bretton Woods are publicly available. There was no secrecy. The architects of this system were not concealing their intentions. They genuinely believed they were building something rational and beneficial. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, argued for a more balanced architecture that would place obligations on surplus nations as well as deficit ones. The American delegation, representing the dominant economic power of the era, prevailed with a framework that reflected American interests and assumptions about how open markets should function. Those assumptions became the operating logic of global finance. 80 years later, when a country in sub-Saharan Africa takes an emergency loan from the IMF, it is operating within a structure designed by people who had never governed such a country and could not have imagined the specific pressures it would face. When it issues bonds on international markets, those bonds are almost invariably governed by the laws of New York or England, not by the laws of the issuing nation. If the country defaults and creditors pursue legal action, the case is heard in foreign courts, under foreign statutes, by judges appointed by foreign governments. The debtor nation signs contracts placing its obligations legally on soil it does not control. There is a concept called debt sustainability analysis, the technical assessment of whether a country can realistically honor what it owes. The IMF publishes these analyses for nations it lends to. They contain projections about economic growth, commodity prices, exchange rate trajectories, political stability. The projections have sometimes been significantly wrong. In 2013, the fund published an internal assessment acknowledging that its projections for Greece during the Eurozone crisis had substantially underestimated the economic damage that prescribed austerity measures would generate. The Greek economy shrank by more than a quarter over 5 years. Youth unemployment climbed above 60%. An entire generation of Greeks entered adulthood in a country that had contracted to a scale not seen since the Second World War. The projections had been wrong. The interest had not been wrong. The interest had arrived precisely as scheduled, every quarter, regardless of what the projections had failed to anticipate. Here is the deepest problem at the center of this entire structure. There is no international bankruptcy mechanism for sovereign nations, no equivalent of Chapter 11, no orderly legal process through which a country can acknowledge that the mathematics of its obligations no longer align with the realities of its economy, restructure what it owes in a fair and transparent forum, and emerge with a genuine prospect of recovery. When a corporation cannot pay its creditors, established legal procedure governs the process. Stakeholders have defined rights. The outcome is regulated. The purpose, at least theoretically, is to balance competing legitimate interests. When a country cannot pay, there is negotiation. There is political pressure. There is the asymmetry between a small nation desperate for access to credit and large creditors who can outlast any administration. The United Nations has passed resolutions calling for the creation of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. These resolutions are non-binding. The nations with sufficient economic weight to make such a mechanism meaningful, the primary creditor nations, have not agreed to constrain their own leverage in this way. The mechanism that would protect debtor nations most has never been built, because the nations most capable of building it benefit from its absence. So, who do countries owe? They owe their own populations through pension funds and domestic financial institutions, people whose savings are quietly funneled back into government borrowing without their knowledge or meaningful consent. They owe foreign governments, whose financial relationships carry political weight that accumulates silently, reshaping diplomacy and foreign policy in ways that never appear in official statements. They owe international institutions whose emergency financing comes with conditions authored by the nations that will never themselves require emergency financing. And they owe a growing constellation of newer players whose terms appear different on the surface, but whose leverage, when repayment falters, ultimately functions by the same logic as every creditor that preceded them. The names rotate, the structure persists. Sovereign debt is not an accounting challenge. It is a map of power, a mechanism through which resources flow consistently upward through the global hierarchy, not through coercion or violence, but through contracts and interest rates and legal frameworks that locate disputes on creditor territory. Everything within the rules, everything documented and signed and legally enforceable. And yet billions of people alive today are living beneath the weight of obligations they never personally incurred, negotiated by administrations they may not have elected, under terms designed in rooms they were never invited to enter. The borrowing was conducted in their name. The bill found them anyway. None of this is a story about individual malice. The pension fund manager is trying to protect retirees. The IMF economist genuinely believes in the policies being prescribed. The creditor nation is acting within rational self-interest in a system that rewards that behavior. The infrastructure lender sees an opportunity where others see only risk. The problem is not the individual actors. The problem is a system optimized, across 8 decades of cumulative decisions, to protect the position of those already positioned to lend, at the expense of those positioned only to borrow. And the people who pay the real cost of that optimization are almost never the ones who sign the agreements. The next time a country appears in a headline because it cannot service its obligations, resist the first question, how did they spend so much? Ask the questions underneath it. Who extended these loans and under what conditions? Who holds the legal jurisdiction when disputes arise? Who wrote the rules governing this arrangement, and in whose interest were those rules written? And when the economic projections that justified the original lending turn out to have been wrong, as they so often do, who absorbs that error? Because in the architecture of sovereign debt, the projections fail regularly. The interest arrives on time, every time, without exception. That is what this channel exists to show you. The version of economic history where you follow the actual movement of power and money, not the version that appears in official statements and press releases. The Capital Files. Subscribe, and we will keep going deeper.